She came from nothing, not a very successful actress. She had.
There was always talk of reconciliation. Charles and William, she's a person who started from nothing and has become a world global star.
Tom Bauer found something really strange about Meghan Markle's age. And once you see the numbers, you can't unsee them. There's this magazine from 1997 sitting in archives right now that lists her as 21 years old. But here's the weird part. If her official birthday is what we've all been told, she would have been 15 back then. Not 16, not 17, 15. That's a 6-year gap that doesn't just vanish with a typo. And when her own father started talking about her childhood timeline, things got even more confusing. Because if the math actually checks out, if what's written in these old magazines is accurate, then everything shifts.
Former royal aide Samantha Cohen has confirmed for the first time that she was one of 10 staffers interviewed by the palace as part
of career, the royal wedding, even the timeline around her kids, none of it lines up the way we thought. So let's look at what's actually on paper and figure out why the numbers don't match. Now trust me, what's coming is gonna make you question everything. Hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell because you don't want to miss this. And if you're already hooked, go ahead and drop a like. All right, let's dive in. When most dads talk about their daughters, there's usually warmth in their voice, pride, maybe some embarrassing stories thrown in. But when Thomas Markle talks about Meghan, there's something heavier hanging there.
I do, and I think it has divided the nation and made us all, many of us, very unhappy on either side of the argument. I just found that...
like he's trying to set something straight before it's too late. He remembers her childhood pretty clearly, the theater stuff, the ambition, how determined she was even as a kid. She wasn't the type to sit still. She had goals, plans, this drive that made her stand out even when she was young. But when Meghan became famous and started doing interviews, giving speeches, building this whole public persona, he noticed something that didn't sit right. The timeline she'd mentioned publicly when she graduated high school, when she started auditioning for roles.
Meghan Markle plans to leave Prince Harry to become a billionaire and run for the governor of California.
And here's the kicker. He believes her next move...
Even how old she was when she finally landed her first big acting gigs. It didn't match what he remembered as her dad. And we're not talking about fuzzy memories here. Parents remember milestones. They remember graduation years, first apartments, when their kid finally caught a break in Hollywood. Those aren't details you forget. And here's the thing. Thomas wasn't making a scene about it. He wasn't calling press conferences or going on some media tour. He was just talking carefully, almost like he was recounting memories that didn't quite line up with what everyone else was saying.
Australia was supposed to be Meghan Markle's crown jewel moment. Back in 2018, when she and Prince Harry swept across Sydney and Melbourne.
Measured, thoughtful, he'd mentioned that Meghan might not be quite as young as the palace made her seem, that maybe somewhere between Los Angeles and London, the years got fuzzy. The dates started looking different on paper than they did in his memory. Those observations hit differently, coming from a father. They're not the kind you can brush off as gossip or internet chatter. This isn't some random person on Twitter connecting dots that don't exist. This is someone who was there from day one. Someone who held her baby photos in his hands, who remembered actual dates and milestones.
Netflix thought they were done with the Meghan Markle circus. Her multi-million-dollar deal fizzled out, her shows tanked.
Not from entertainment blogs or royal press releases, but from real life, from being there, from living it. Think about that for a second. A father noticing the public timeline of his own daughter doesn't match his memories. That's not something casual. That's not some small detail you mention in passing. When Thomas brought up that the Meghan he raised, the one he watched grow up, didn't quite line up with what the palace was telling the world, it opened something up. The first real crack in her carefully polished royal image.
Tom Bauer just discovered one of the most puzzling age mysteries in modern royal history. In his words, the version of...
And that's when people started getting curious, pulling out old magazines, digging through archives, looking for anything that might show what he was talking about. Because if a father's memory doesn't match the official version, then maybe the official version isn't the only one out there. Maybe there's another side to the story sitting in old files somewhere, just waiting to be noticed. March 1997. Teenagers across America are flipping through 17 magazine, the go-to glossy for high school girls dreaming about college, careers, and maybe landing a spot in Hollywood someday. It's the kind of magazine you'd find stacked at checkout counters.
Holy hit piece, Batman. A lot of you probably saw this article in the Times over the weekend. Prepare to see a lot
Passed around cafeterias, pages dog-eared and covered in notes, and buried deep inside that March issue, on page 90, there's this small list of names, aspiring faces, young people trying to make it. One of those names reads, Meghan Markle, age 21. At first glance, it's nothing, right? Just another entry in a long list of hopefuls. But when you actually stop and do the math, it gets confusing. If Meghan was really born on August 4th, 1981, like every official record says, then in March 1997, she would have been 15 years old. Not 16, not almost 16, 15. That's a 6-year difference between what's printed here and what we've been told.
What if I told you there's no proof Meghan Markle ever gave birth to Archie or Lilibet? Tonight, royal investigator
Now here's what makes this interesting. This isn't some random blog post from 2015 or a screenshot floating around social media that could have been edited in someone's basement. This is ink on paper. A physical document that was published, printed, sold in stores, and archived decades before Meghan ever became a duchess, before she even met Prince Harry, before anyone outside of Hollywood casting directors knew her name. You can still find that issue today, flip to page 90, and the number's right there staring back at you. 21.
They told us Meghan Markle's story was a fairy tale. A Hollywood actress who found love with a prince, broke royal rules.
If that magazine's listing is accurate, then the entire foundation of her story shifts. Her schooling, her early acting years, that whole fresh-faced actress just starting out image, it all moves forward by 6 years. It'd mean Meghan wasn't some 20-something chasing her dream when she started landing roles. She was closer to 30, already a woman who'd been navigating Hollywood for a while, in an industry that's absolutely obsessed with youth. An industry where being 25 versus 31 can be the difference between getting cast or getting passed over. And that's not a small detail.
So here's the story most people are too polite to tell. Meghan Markle's life looks like a dream. Designer wardrobes, private...
In Hollywood, age is everything. It determines what roles you're offered, how you're marketed, whether you're seen as an up-and-comer or someone who's been around the block. If the 17 listing matches reality, then the timeline we've been given doesn't tell the whole story. So now you've got two versions sitting side by side. The official one that says she was born in 1981, making her 44 in 2025. And then there's this magazine just casually listing her as 21 in 1997, which would push her birth year back to around 1975 or 1976.
Just feels like it doesn't matter how many concessions King Charles and Prince William make to the Sussex.
That'd make her approaching 50 today. And listen, there's nothing wrong with any age, but when the public record says one thing and an old magazine says something completely different, that's not just a quirky detail. That's two totally different stories. Think about what that changes. It shifts when she graduated, when she moved to LA, when she started auditioning, when she met Harry, even when she walked into the royal family. If she was born in the mid-70s, she wasn't a rising 36-year-old actress when she got married.
Whenever they need money, whenever they need publicity to stoke their reputation, they'll drop another little bomb.
Bauer shreds the illusion by showing how every carefully...
She was a woman in her early 40s stepping into one of the most watched families on earth. The crazy part? This magazine came out in 1997. That's almost 30 years ago. It's been sitting in archives this whole time, just waiting for someone to notice the numbers don't match. And now that people have, it's impossible to ignore. Because once you see that 6-year gap, once you realize there are two completely different timelines out there.
The Queen, who was described by Harry as vicious in his book, and Kate and William, who were unbelievably traduced.
You start wondering what else might not line up, and that's where this gets really wild. So let's lay this out side by side, because it's honestly kind of mind-blowing when you see it written down. You've got version 1, the official record. Meghan Markle, born August 4th, 1981, Los Angeles, California. That makes her 44 years old in 2025. This version shows up everywhere. Palace files, online biographies, royal press statements, Wikipedia, IMDb, you name it. It's treated like it's carved in stone.
They told us Meghan Markle's story was a fairy tale. A Hollywood actress who found love with a prince broke royal rules.
Unchangeable, permanent. Then you've got version 2, the magazine record. Meghan Markle listed as 21 years old in March 1997. If you work backwards from that, her birth year lands somewhere around 1975 or 1976, which would mean she's approaching 50 today. Not 44, not mid-40s, 50. And here's the weird part. These aren't two slightly different dates that could be explained away with a simple mix-up. This is a 6-year shift in the timeline. Think about what 6 years means in someone's life. That's not a detail.
Sharpening his quill for a new edition of his book set to reveal huge secret.
That's elementary school versus middle school. That's college versus late 20s. That's getting married at 36 versus getting married at 42. 6 years changes the whole picture. So what does this actually shift? Well, for starters, it changes how old she was when she graduated from Northwestern University. It changes when she first started acting, when she landed on Suits, when she became a recognizable name in Hollywood. And most importantly, it changes how old she was when she met Prince Harry and when she walked down the aisle at Windsor Castle. If she was born in 1981, she was 36 when she got married.
Meghan Markle is no stranger to public scrutiny, but this time, the gloves are off. Acclaimed investigative author Tom.
But if she was born in the mid-70s, she was in her early 40s. Both ages are totally fine, obviously, but it's just a different picture of the same story. And this is where things get interesting. There's this metaphor that fits perfectly here. Ink versus pencil. Ink is permanent, right? Like a birth certificate. Something official, something you can't just erase or change. But pencil can be erased, redrawn, sketched over.
Prince Harry will not make Meghan Markle a billionaire. She wants to be a billionaire, so who will? A new man. At some point, if it's offered up, it may.
The world was handed the ink version of Meghan's story, the official one, the permanent one. But that 17 magazine record, that was pencil. Faint, easy to overlook, forgotten in an archive somewhere, but still visible if you actually look for it. So which one's accurate? That's the question that doesn't really have an answer right now. Because if the magazine got it right back in 1997, before anyone had a reason to think twice about it, then things get confusing. And if the official record is accurate, then how did a nationally published magazine get it so differently?
You know what's wild? For someone who once said she didn't Google her own husband before dating him, Meghan Markle sure played the fame game like
6 years isn't a typo. It's not someone misreading handwriting or mixing up numbers. It's a completely different age. What makes this even stranger is that nobody's really talked about it. There's no statement saying, hey, the magazine made a mistake, here's what actually happened. There's no correction printed anywhere. There's just silence. 2 versions of the same person's age sitting out there in the world, both on paper, both published decades ago. And nobody's addressing why they're so different. And here's what really makes you think. If the numbers are off by 6 years, what else might be different than what we've seen? Because age isn't just a number when you're in the public eye. It affects how people see you, what kind of roles you get offered, what story people connect with. A 36-year-old marrying a prince feels like one kind of story. A 42-year-old doing the same thing is still great, but it's just different. So now you've got a father who says the dates don't match his memories. You've got a magazine from 1997 that lists a completely different age. And you've got official records that say something else entirely. Somewhere between Los Angeles and London, between Hollywood and royalty, the years got mixed up. And the gap is there, documented, sitting in archives, just kind of hanging in the air without explanation. So if the age thing already has you scratching your head, wait until you hear about Archie's birth story. Because this is where things go from confusing to really head-scratching when you actually look at the numbers. Tom Bower noticed some strange inconsistencies in how the whole thing was described. And a hospital insider from Portland Hospital, someone who actually worked there, was thinking the same thing. The official version, the one that showed up in Prince Harry's book Spare, painted this really calm, almost movie-like picture of how it all went down. According to Harry's telling, there were 2 epidurals.
Side by side, the contradiction becomes impossible to ignore. Version 1. The official record, Meghan Markle born
a really serene environment, quick recovery, and then the couple left within 2 hours to head back to Frogmore Cottage. It sounded peaceful, controlled, like everything went exactly according to plan. But here's where it gets weird. Anyone who's familiar with how childbirth actually works, especially at a place like Portland Hospital, started noticing things that didn't quite make sense. Because Portland isn't some spa or boutique wellness center. It's a proper medical facility with strict procedures.
It is interesting how she's exposing her as a yacht girl, someone who was paid off by rich men to go and hang out.
Especially when you're dealing with situations that need extra monitoring. And those two epidurals Harry mentioned, doctors started raising eyebrows at that. Because epidurals don't really work that way. You don't get two separate ones like you're taking painkillers. An epidural is continuous. It's administered once through a catheter that stays in place and delivers medication throughout labor. You don't double up. It's not how the procedure typically goes. So when Harry described it that way, medical professionals were just kind of confused about what that actually meant. What started as this sweet birth story was turning into something that didn't quite add up when you looked closer. Because when you start doing the actual math on the timeline,
when it comes to these royal tell-all books, it is helpful to know who is writing them. We didn't have time in my last video to go into...
things get really confusing. Here's where it gets interesting. Harry's version says Meghan gave birth, recovered, and was back home at Frogmore Cottage within 2 hours. But let's break that down for a second. The drive from Portland Hospital to Frogmore alone takes roughly an hour, sometimes more depending on traffic. That means everything. Delivery, recovery, observation, getting dressed, walking out, everything would have had to happen in about 1 hour, maybe less. And that's before you even...
Every party at Soho House, every private retreat, every first-class flight, all came courtesy of someone powerful enough to cover...
Think about the epidurals. Because here's the thing about epidurals, and anyone who's had one can tell you this. You can't just get up and walk right after. You have to wait for the anesthesia to wear off. Your legs are numb. You need time for sensation to come back, for your blood pressure to stabilize, for the medical team to make sure everything's okay. That's not optional. That's how it works everywhere, especially at hospitals that follow standard procedures. So if Meghan really had one epidural, let alone two like Harry described, it's really hard to picture how she was walking out in under 2 hours. It's not about being tough or anything like that.
Is feeling mortal. He would like some sort of settlement. I don't believe for a moment that William and Camilla...
It's just how the body processes the medication. Most hospitals won't even discharge you until you can stand and walk on your own, and that usually takes several hours, not minutes. Add everything together, the delivery itself, waiting for the epidural effects to fade, monitoring vitals, making sure mom and baby are both stable, and you're looking at way more than a 2-hour window. The timeline Harry described feels more like a highlight reel than a real-time account.
To a punchline. Twitter threads compare her situation to past celebrity implosions, from Paula Deen's sponsorship collapse.
And that's what got people wondering about how the story was told versus how things typically go in a hospital. Some doctors who read Harry's account said the timeline felt a bit off compared to standard hospital experiences, not because they're being critical, but just because the medical side of things doesn't quite line up with what was described. And when you're talking about something as important as childbirth, especially in such a watched situation, those details do stand out when they don't match typical procedures. So now you've got a birth story that doesn't quite fit standard medical timelines.
Flat at another just hours later. Pregnancy doesn't work like that. The human body doesn't shrink and expand in sync with camera angles.
Math that's really hard to make work, and a hospital that follows pretty strict protocols. And the interesting part, it's still a bit unclear how all the pieces fit together. There's the story as written, and then there's what medical professionals know about how these things usually work. And somewhere between those two things, there's a gap that's hard to explain. Now here's where the medical side gets even more interesting. Every pregnancy record and doctor will tell you the same thing. Meghan's pregnancy was classified as geriatric. And before anyone gets upset about that term, it's not an insult.
You know what's wild? For someone who once said she didn't Google her own husband before dating him, Meghan Markle sure played the fame game like...
It's literally the clinical classification for expectant mothers over 35. It's a medical category, not a judgment. But what it does mean is that the pregnancy requires way tighter monitoring, fewer variables left to chance, and pretty much full-time medical supervision during labor. This isn't optional, it's protocol. So when Harry described birthing balls, candles, and what basically sounded like a wellness retreat setup, it raised some questions. That's not typically how births in this category are handled, like at all. According to the Hospital Insider, Portland doesn't usually do spa-style births for mothers who've been flagged as needing extra monitoring.
They told us Meghan Markle's story was a fairy tale. A Hollywood actress who found love with a prince, broke royal rules, and built a new...
The setup Harry described, soft lighting, water tub, birthing ball, ambient music, that's not something that would typically be set up for someone under close obstetric watch. It's just how medical facilities usually operate when there's elevated risk involved. Think about it this way. When you're over 35 and pregnant, especially with a first baby, hospitals are way more cautious. They monitor everything more closely. Heart rate, blood pressure, baby's position, all of it. The goal is to minimize any chance of complications. So the idea of having this really relaxed, almost home birth style environment is a bit different from how these situations are typically managed in a hospital setting.
Once upon a time, Meghan Markle's story felt like something out of a Hollywood movie. A young woman from
Usually, you're hooked up to monitors. There are nurses checking in frequently. It's more medical than peaceful. And then there's the mention of preeclampsia, which is one of the most serious complications a mother can face during pregnancy or delivery. For anyone who's lived through it or knows someone who has, it's intense. The treatment involves a lot. You're talking about magnesium sulfate through an IV, constant blood pressure monitoring, sometimes even bed rest for days.
To sources, this is where the first version of Meghan's network took form, the one that existed off paper, away from headlines, and long before.
They watch you really carefully because preeclampsia can escalate quickly, and when it does, it's serious for both mom and baby. If Meghan dealt with preeclampsia, like some have mentioned, then the 2-hour turnaround from delivery to being back home is really puzzling from a medical standpoint. Because when you're being treated for preeclampsia, hospitals typically keep you under observation for a while. They make sure your blood pressure stabilizes. They monitor for complications. You usually stay until the doctors are confident everything's okay.
A massive sea change here in the United Kingdom, with Prince William now winning.
The whole spa-like birth setup Harry described, that's pretty different from what preeclampsia treatment typically looks like. You're not usually sitting on a birthing ball with scented candles when you're receiving magnesium sulfate. You're typically in a hospital bed with monitors, nurses coming in and out, checking vitals regularly. It's not relaxing, it's clinical, because it needs to be. That's what helps keep everyone safe. So you've got this interesting contrast. On one hand, Harry's describing this peaceful, almost spa-like birth experience with minimal medical intervention.
Hold on tight because Meghan Markle is outraged as Tom Bauer drops a bombshell. Archie and Lilet may not even exist.
On the other hand, if Meghan was over 35 and dealing with preeclampsia, she would typically be under pretty intense medical care. Those two scenarios are just really different from each other. And here's what makes medical professionals curious. Even without preeclampsia, even if everything went smoothly, the geriatric pregnancy classification alone usually means you're not getting the wellness retreat treatment. You're typically getting standard protocols for situations that need extra attention, continuous fetal monitoring, medical staff on standby in case anything changes.
Back to the days when Meghan Markle was still orbiting the edges of power, quietly learning how that world worked. Because before...
It's not about being restrictive. It's just about being careful. What Harry described sounds really beautiful, honestly. It sounds like the kind of birth experience a lot of people hope for. Calm, peaceful, in control, but it's just a bit different from what typically happens in a hospital when you're in a category that needs extra monitoring. And that's what's puzzling. The experience he described and what usually happens in these situations seem like two different things. Medical professionals who've worked in labor and delivery have mentioned that the timeline, the setup, the procedures described, they're a bit different from what they typically see in hospital settings.
Hold on to your seats, folks. Bauer wasted no time calling out the so-called Sussex Summit leak, for what he believes it,
especially with patients who need extra monitoring. It's not about being critical. It's just that the details seem different from standard practice. And when you're talking about something as well established as hospital birth procedures, when things seem different, it does make you wonder. By this point, there's a pattern. You've got a birth story that describes things that don't usually happen together, a timeline that's mathematically tricky, a risk classification that typically requires one type of care, but a description that sounds pretty different. And through all of it, there's this gap between what was described and what medical professionals typically see. The details are just a bit puzzling when you compare them to how these things usually go. So by now, you're probably noticing something. There's a pattern here that's hard to ignore. You've got the age thing, where a father's memories don't match the official dates, and a magazine from 1997 that lists a completely different number. Then you've got the birth story, where the timeline doesn't really work with standard medical procedures, and the setup doesn't fit what typically happens in these situations. Two completely separate parts of the same person's life, both with details that just don't quite line up.
Hold on tight, because veteran royal biographer Tom Bower launched a brutal, fact-loaded takedown of Meghan Markle. Bold.
And here's what's interesting about patterns like this. When one thing doesn't add up, you can usually chalk it up to a mistake, a mix-up, someone getting their facts crossed. But when multiple things don't add up, when you've got inconsistencies showing up in different areas, that's when you start wondering what's going on. Not in a conspiracy theory way, but just in a why is this so confusing way. Think about it. The age discrepancy isn't just a small typo. It's a 6-year difference printed in a national magazine decades ago. That's not someone accidentally writing the wrong number. And the birth story isn't just...
He pushed in private meetings. He argued in interviews. He demanded recognition. Why fight so hard? Because titles aren't
one odd detail. It's a whole series of things. The timeline, the medical procedures, the recovery period, that all seem different when you compare them to how hospitals actually work. Two different stories, two different time periods, but the same feeling of, wait, that doesn't make sense. What makes this even more curious is the silence around it all. When things don't add up in someone's public story, usually there's some kind of response. A clarification, a correction, someone coming forward to explain what actually happened. But here, there's just nothing.
So here's the story most people are too polite to tell. Meghan Markle's life looks like a dream. Designer wardrobes, private jets.
The magazine from 1997 never got a follow-up saying, hey, we printed the wrong age. Thomas Markle's observations about the timeline never got addressed. The medical timeline questions from doctors and hospital insiders, those just kind of hang in the air without any official response. And that silence is interesting because when you don't address something, when you just let these questions sit there unanswered, people start filling in the blanks themselves. They start wondering why nobody's clearing things up if it's all just simple mistakes. They start looking closer at other details.
Who was described by Harry as vicious in his book, and Kate and William, who were unbelievably traduced.
Trying to figure out what else might be different from what was presented. Here's the thing about public image, especially royal public image. Everything is usually so controlled, so precise, so carefully managed. Every appearance, every statement, every photo is thought through. So when there are gaps in the story, when there are things that don't get explained, it stands out even more. Because if everything else is managed so carefully, why would these particular details be left unclear? You've got two different pictures here. There's the version that was presented to the public, the official timeline, the official ages, the official birth story, everything polished and perfect like it went through multiple.
So here's the story most people are too polite to tell. Meghan Markle's life looks like a dream. Designer wardrobes, private
rounds of review, and then you've got the other picture, the one that shows up in old magazines, in hospital procedures, in what medical professionals know about how these things actually work. The one that's a bit messier, a bit less perfect, but also a bit more specific. And somewhere between those two pictures is where things get really interesting. Not in the polished version, not in the archives, but somewhere in the middle where they don't quite meet up. The question is, which picture is more accurate? The one that sounds perfect or the one that shows up in old documents?
Who wronged whom in that relationship?
Well, I think we're going to start with the opera interview. I mean, I think that we've all counted.
What Tom Bauer noticed, what the Hospital Insider brought up, what Thomas Markle mentioned, it all comes back to the same basic question. Why don't the details match? Why does a birth story describe things that don't typically happen together in a medical setting? Why does a magazine from 1997 have a completely different age than every official record since then? Why does a father's memory of his daughter's timeline not line up with what the world was told? These aren't small questions. They're not nitpicky details that don't really matter. Because when you're stepping into one of the most famous families in the world, when everything about you becomes public record, the details do matter. The dates matter. The timeline matters.
She didn't want to have to walk behind Kate Middleton, you know, the future queen. She felt that they should.
People want to understand the real story, not just the version that got the most polish. And maybe that's what's interesting here. Real life is complicated. Real life has medical procedures that take time and follow specific protocols. It has dates that are what they are. It has numbers that show up in old magazines that don't always match newer records. And when all these complicated pieces don't fit together neatly, that's when things get confusing. By the time you reach this point, after looking at the magazine, the birth timeline, the medical procedures, the silence around all these questions, you can't help but notice the pattern. Every story has two versions.
Well, I think Harry is a very complicated person because he's not very intelligent and undoubtedly remains damaged.
The official one that sounds smooth and perfect, and the one that shows up in documents and medical realities that's a bit more complicated. And those two versions don't quite sync up. Maybe it's just what happens when you're in the spotlight at that level. Maybe details get remembered differently. Maybe timelines get simplified for public consumption. Maybe the messy parts get left out because they don't fit the image as well. It's hard to say for sure. But underneath all the polished statements and carefully worded stories
is when Meghan Markle goes to meet Harry's friends for the first time. And they're all his old mates from the royal days. They've all been.
There's still those original documents sitting there. The magazine page that lists 21 when the math says it should be 15. The medical timeline, that doesn't work on paper. The father who remembers dates that don't match the official version. All of these things documented, sitting in archives or in people's memories, quietly showing a different picture than the one we were given. And once you've seen those differences, once you've noticed that the numbers don't quite add up and the stories don't quite fit together, they're hard to ignore. They're just there now, documented, waiting for anyone who wants to look closer.
Meghan's lifestyle brand and jam jars? Crickets. Meanwhile, the upkeep of their Montecito mansion? PR.
Because when the polished version doesn't quite match the paperwork, it leaves you wondering which one tells the fuller story. So where does all of this leave us? With a lot more questions than answers, honestly. You've got a magazine from 1997 that says one thing, official records that say another, and a 6-year gap nobody's explained. You've got a father who remembers his daughter's childhood one way, and public timelines that tell a different story. And there's the birth narrative that describes medical procedures and timelines that don't quite match how hospitals actually operate. And the wild part? All of this is documented.
Meghan Markle kicked off CNN this morning after a heated dispute with Anderson Cooper. Meghan Markle was
This isn't speculation or internet rumors. The 17 magazine is real. You can find it. Thomas Markle's observations are out there in interviews. Medical professionals have spoken about what typically happens in these situations. It's all on record, just creating this weird puzzle where the pieces don't quite fit together. Remember that ink versus pencil thing? That really captures what's going on here. Birth certificates, hospital records, official documents, those are supposed to be permanent. But when you've got a magazine listing a different age, medical timelines that don't quite work out, personal memories that don't match public statements.
She didn't want to have to walk behind Kate Middleton, you know, the future queen. She felt that they should.
It becomes this really confusing situation where you're not sure which numbers to trust. Here's what stays the same though. That magazine still says 21 when the math says 15. Hospital procedures still take longer than 2 hours. Fathers still remember their kids' milestones. These are things that exist on their own. And when they don't line up with the official story, it leaves this gap where you're not quite sure which version makes more sense. What makes it interesting is we're talking about two major life events, birth year and birth of a child.
The war is that we're going to give our version of events and we're going to tell it in our terms.
Those aren't minor details, they're foundational. And when both have some confusion attached, when both have versions that don't quite match up, you start to wonder what actually happened. The thing is, we might never get a clear answer. Nobody's coming forward to explain the magazine discrepancy. Nobody's clarifying the hospital timeline. The questions just hang there, unanswered, while the official version stays polished and perfect. What Tom Bauer noticed, what medical insiders pointed out, what Thomas Markle mentioned, it all created this picture that's a bit different from the one we were shown. Different enough that once you see the gaps, they're hard to ignore. So maybe the real curiosity isn't in the official statements or polished memoir.